All right, welcome everyone to our Humane AI Conversation. Today I am delighted to welcome Gijs van Howelingen to this conversation. He is an assistant professor at the Faculty of Economics and Business in the section Strategy and International Business. And he has been working on AI and let's say technological aversion and appreciation. He will tell us a little bit more about that. And then we will engage in a conversation. And if anybody in the audience wants to jump in, we will reserve a time slot later. So at the end of the conversation, then we will open up the forum for everyone to jump in. So hi, I'm delighted to welcome you here. Looking forward to this conversation. Maybe before we start discussing, you can briefly introduce your research project and what are you working on with in relation to AI?
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Gijs van Howelingen. It's very well pronounced, Chris. So thank you for that. I'm an assistant professor at the business school, at the business school. I'm in the strategy international business section, but I'm more of an organizational psych scholar actually. So I look at like psychological processes in organizations or with the relation between people and organizations. So in this research project came out of a seed grant actually we got from the Humane AI project or research priority area. And maybe it's the best way to introduce it is also to tell a little bit about how the project evolved from sort of its original conception to where we are now. Because originally we were very interested in understanding, particularly what you just mentioned, appreciation and aversion, right? So we were really interested in understanding in what context we would find appreciation, what context we would find aversion. That came out of the observation, but also in the organizational literature, there's some literature on AI adoptions in firms and broader in organizations. Both these phenomena have been observed, right? So in some cases, people are quite averse to adoption of AI. In other contexts, people are actually quite appreciative of it. And so we were very interested in, so what are sort of the organizational contextual variables that might influence whether somebody is averse or appreciative? And that is still an interesting question, I think. But when we progressed, we started to notice that oftentimes what we saw is not so much just aversion or just appreciation, but basically both, right? If you try to measure it, oftentimes we found strong effects on both. And that is what got us interested in the phenomenon of ambivalence. So that's where we are now. We're very interested in what you might call technology ambivalence or AI ambivalence. And ambivalence is, I think, also just like outside of the AI technology domain, a very interesting phenomenon that's not very well understood. It's been studied for decades already, but it's not been studied well enough, I think. So ambivalence we can define as the simultaneously activation of aversive or approach and avoid tendency, so aversive and appreciative. So the basic idea of many psychologists is that we have like a behavioral inhibition and behavioral activation system, an approach and avoid tendencies that we sort of use to respond to stimuli, right? As threatening stimuli activate the avoid tendencies that we have for like something that we find attractive, maybe something without food or person that activates approach tendencies. But oftentimes these two tendencies are activated simultaneously, right? We both feel appreciative and aversive, or we both have high avoid and avoid tendencies. And the outcomes of that experience of ambivalence are very interesting. I think specifically in the AI domain. Because if you look at some of the literature on sort of how people think about and respond to AI as sort of a general phenomenon, you get the impression that people should be very wary, very avert of those types of technologies for many different reasons. But if you look in society, I mean, people use the Netflix algorithm or the YouTube algorithm quite uncritically. So there seems to be sort of a gap between what we think is supposed to happen and what does happen, and we think that ambivalence is a lens to understand why that is the case, right? And I think so. Ambivalence is interesting for two reasons. One is a little bit more academic. The other one is a little bit more practical. So from an academic perspective, ambivalence predicts noise in a way. Right? So when people are ambivalent, or any life form is ambivalent, the idea of ambivalence actually comes from behavioral studies with rats, for instance, in the 50s. Would be given both a reward and a punishment, and we saw, and what happens is that they oscillate between approach and avoid tendencies, right? So you get basically oscillation, you get noise, behavioral noise in a way, right? So it might be, from an academic perspective, if it's indeed true, and we're still in the process of figuring out to what extent it's true, that many people are ambivalent about AI driven technologies, then a lot of the types of outcomes we see in the literature are in fact in a way noise, right? They're just sort of by chance, because it's just the result of sort of behavioral variability, behavioral affiliation. The second more practical thing that I think is interesting about ambivalence is that people are very easily drawn to one or the other extreme by experience ambivalence. So I'm ambivalent about something, and I typically don't want to be ambivalent, right? And for instance, and that doesn't really depend on the target of the ambivalence, right? It might be an AI agent, but might also be just a human being. Like I might be ambivalent about you. So what happens is I want to resolve that ambivalence quite quickly, right? So I basically jump on the first cue that comes to mind, right? In the case where I might be ambivalent about another person, maybe they might do something. I take that as a cue to make a judgment about the other person. Okay, this person is a good person or a bad person. I'm gonna be affiliated with this person or not. So I go to the extreme. I want to resolve my ambivalence, and therefore I make a judgment based on just one cue. And then the same thing might be true for AI technology, right? That we might observe a strong aversion, a strong appreciation, just because people want to resolve their ambivalence based on just one simple cue. And we think that might be a problem. Yeah, so because it causes maybe unreflective avoidance of the technology, but also maybe unreflective use. Right? Because people feel ambivalent and they want to get out of that state of ambivalence, they just go in one direction or the other direction. Whereas it might be better to live with the ambivalence and stay sort of vigilant whilst engaging with the technology. I hope that sort of is a good summary of where we're at.
No, that's super helpful, and I really like the depth your research goes into. Before I ask you how you actually research it from an empirical perspective, I have a few other questions, because sure. First, when I read the abstract and I was more familiar with your research, I thought, okay, maybe this ambivalence stems from a lack of, let's say, AI literacy or some sort of expertise with these new technologies. And then I thought, okay, maybe it is like having more expertise or strengthen in AI literacy within yourself, but also within the wider society, could help to reduce this ambivalence. But then at the same time, I would say I'm dealing with these kind of issues every day, and I would say I'm quite literate of AI technologies, but I still feel this ambivalence every day.
Right.
So I'm not sure whether increasing knowledge about the topic or about how algorithms and AI works could actually help to reduce this ambivalence. What do you think of that?
But that's actually, I think, a very astute observation, and I think that really ties well with our thinking as well, because we think basically that there might be two sources of AI ambivalence, and the first one is, like you were saying, lack of literacy. Right? It's a new phenomenon for a lot of people. It's oftentimes people just have maybe images of like sci-fi movies in their head or something like that, so they don't really understand the phenomenon so much, and that drives ambivalence. But and that's a sort of ambivalence, obviously, we could address by increasing knowledge and increasing literacy. So that should be relatively still a challenge, obviously, but should be relatively easily resolved. And then there's the other source, which ties in with a much deeper sort of level of our psychology, which is the following notion, is that agentic technologies, so technologies that have some level of artificial intelligence, do not fall neatly into one of the boxes that we basically have in our mind to deal with different entities in the world, right? So typically, when we engage with entities in the world, we think about whether they have the capacities of mind, basically. So that's agency and experience. Can they plan actions? Can they feel, basically? And so objects, for instance, like this water bottle here, I don't think it's still as well. This water bottle here, it doesn't have agency nor experience. So it's an object, right? We know I can manipulate it. It won't like protest. Okay, I can do anything with that. What I want to do, I can throw it away. That's an object, right? And there are human beings that are both agentic and experiential. So I could take into account the fact that they have intentions, they have feelings. That means that I have like maybe some moral obligations towards them. But agentic technologies fall somewhere in between, right? They're not quiet objects. They're not machines in the traditional sense of the word. I can push a button and something like predictable happens, right? They're also not animals, right? Animals have a level of feeling that I can sort of predict what will happen. Like if I hit it, it will probably like attack or walk away. But they don't have feeling. So they're in between the different categories that we have to understand sort of the inner processes of the entities that we engage with, if that makes sense, right? So in that sense, they're deeply ambivalent or ambiguous, I should say, deeply ambiguous entities from a psychological standpoint. And I think that is a source of ambivalence that is much harder to address. You can be super literate and still, when engaging with, for instance, like an AI that's sort of based on neural networks, that's unpredictable in terms of its outcomes, still feel very ambivalent about it because it's none of the things that we're sort of used to thinking about. It's not an animal, it's not a machine, it's not a human being, it's something in between those categories.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and digging deeper into this ambivalence, because what I thought is that if people have like algorithmic aversion and algorithmic appreciation, maybe that results in these oscillations that you speak of, and these oscillations, how I understood them, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that people maybe become a bit less consistent in their behavior, because sometimes true. They deviate to more aversion and sometimes more to appreciation. But at the same time, I think it is deeply rooted in us as individuals to trying to be as consistent as possible. So how can people resolve this tension? Because this ambivalence reminds me a lot of also cognitive dissonance, for example, where two forces are fighting with each other inside of your mind, and still you want to behave quite consistently. So
Yeah.
in a way, there are different ways to deal with that. And what I can only say from my own experience is when I'm dealing with these issues, sooner or later, I'm just doing one thing because maybe consistency is more important, and also building up technological routines. Either I use this technology or I don't use it. I use it knowing maybe also the detrimental effect it might have, but soon, there might be the danger that this ambivalence slowly gets more into indifference. Right? People maybe then don't care anymore. They just decided for one way because they want to be consistent, and then they don't question the other side anymore. Exactly, so I'm really curious to disentangle the psychological mechanisms that are working here.
Yeah, so that's a very intriguing question. Well, two things. The first is that I definitely, I think that that's my worry as well. At least that's one of the impetus. That's an impetus for the project. It's like the idea that like ambivalence might over time result in like uncritical or unreflective use of a technology. And what we know from the ambivalence literature more generally is that like some people are more and other people are less tolerant to ambivalence, right? So, so there are different sort of individual different variables that have been identified that predict whether or not people can sort of handle ambivalence well or not. And so one is called, for instance, paradox mindset. Are you able to hold two thoughts, two like opposite thoughts in your mind? Or an older construct called tolerance for ambiguity. Are you willing to remain in situations that make you feel ambivalent? What we see is that generally ambivalence has more sort of positive outcomes, outcomes that people are at least happy with themselves. For people that are higher on these tendencies, or people that are better able to hold two thoughts the same time, to deal with paradox, or are more willing to stay within situations that feel ambiguous to them or ambivalent to them. So that's, I think, where the literature is broadly speaking now. What we don't know, but I think what is a very interesting research question is, so can we sort of isolate what it is that people that, for instance, are high in a paradox mindset makes them like better able to deal with paradox? What do they do? And can we teach people that are not as good in that yet? Can we teach them to do that better? Basically, that's just a completely open question. I think. I mean, maybe somebody in the audience knows a little bit more about that. But I don't think there's necessarily an answer to that question yet. But I think it's a very important one, because if indeed, as you sort of pointed out, unreflective use or uncritical use of technologies is a danger that we face in our day and age due to sort of widespread ambivalence about these technologies, then it's very important that we identify ways to help people deal with that ambivalence in a productive way, rather than what you were describing, like moving from one extreme or to the other extreme, and maybe oscillate between the two. Like basically staying with the ambivalence and saying, all right, so this is a type of technology that may help me in certain respect, but has certain dangers, and those two thoughts are both equally valid, and I need to sort of deal with both at the same time.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And what I thought also when I thought about more about this topic is, okay, let's assume people decided for using this technology, and then they make experiences, very individual experience with this technology along the way. Have you researched, or do you know anything about how this ambivalence evolves while people use the technology? Because I would assume that they make constant experiences, so they receive a bit of their constant feedback on their cognitions, on their let's say on the ambivalence, and sooner or later they will one of the two sides will win, let's say. So they will be stronger in their conviction of either using it or not using it, or something like this. Have you dealt with these questions in any way?
We have not yet. I think it's a very important question indeed. I know there's some research being done among American soldiers who, like helicopter pilots, who have to deal with like an AI system that supports them in flying their helicopter. And that's a life or death situation, so it's a highly charged situation, and their ambivalence can be deadly, right? If you on the battlefield oscillate between aversion and appreciation, I mean that can be completely problematic. And what the conclusion, for as far as I know from that line of research, is that essentially it's a trust building exercise, right? In a way, you could basically compare it with getting to know someone, right? So the first moment you meet someone new, you don't know much about them, and you might make a snap judgment. You might be ambivalent, you might make a snap judgment, you might also oscillate, right? And over time, the relationship might evolve, and you build a level of trust with that person. And that means that you're maybe more willing, basically, to sit with the ambivalent, because you can still not completely predict what another person will do or what another person will think. But you might have build a sort of basic level of trust in that other person, that they will not harm you, for instance, right? And that same type of dynamics is what we see in that sort of line of research that I was just referring to with those helicopter pilots. That the pilots are willing and are able to trust the AI system, ultimately are better able to sort of cooperate with it. Whereas the people that are like start out super skeptical, they also like develop a bad cooperative relation with the system. And that sort of brings me to a larger point that I want to sort of maybe mention quickly, is that sort of our psychology has been shaped, obviously, by sort of our development as species, right? I mean, our psychology is a product of years of natural and cultural evolution, right? But we only have one psychology, basically, right? So it's not the case necessarily that there will be like a new, completely untapped part of our psychology that regulates our interactions with AI. It's got to be the same process, right? So oftentimes in interesting ways, I think what we can sort of apply the knowledge that we've learned from sort of the interpersonal sphere to interactions with AI agents, but take into account that those AI agents are sort of perceived as different types of entities than fellow human beings.
Yeah, so going to your research, all of these very interesting research questions and research areas, how do you address them empirically? So what methods are you working with, and what does a study setup look like in your research?
Yeah, so we're interested in two types of ambivalence, actually, and that's called potential ambivalence and felt ambivalence. So potential ambivalence is essentially the extent in which people hold positive and negative attitudes toward an attitude object, for instance, an AI agent. It might not like be felt or experienced as ambivalent, right? I might, if I ask you a question, do you like this agent, and You might say yes, very much, and then like maybe next day I ask you the question, do you dislike this agent? And you might say again, very much, right? So that means that you might have both these attitudes, liking or aversion and appreciation, or liking and disliking. But it might not feel to you as if you're highly ambivalent, right? And that's what's called potential ambivalence. And there's sort of felt ambivalence. So I might ask you, do you have mixed feelings about this agent? Like that's a question that we ask when people want to ask people about felt ambivalence. And those are different phenomena, basically, right? So potential and felt ambivalence have different antecedents and different consequences. What we try to study is, and that's sort of our guiding hypothesis right now, is that like, if circling back to, and not maybe not the last question before that, is that to be able to sort of deal with ambivalence and to be able to sort of use it sort of productively and not fall in the trap of uncritical use, it's better to know that you're ambivalent rather than not know that you're ambivalent, basically. And so what we're looking at is, does potential ambivalence predict uncritical use, and maybe felt ambivalence does not predict that. So we try to measure both in all of our studies, so the question was like, what type of methods we use, right?
Yeah, what type of methods is your when you're dealing with behavioral change? Do you also include behavioral measures, or is it more a self-reported behavior or something like this? I'm interested in the details of your method.
Yeah, exactly. So so typically what we do is we have people sort of respond to different types of AI technologies, just descriptions or pictures. We have them sort of read. Typically we have like algorithmic AI versus robotic AI, and sometimes we also use like chatbots. And we try to measure both potential and felt ambivalence. That's sort of standard setup. And then we try to also collect some behavioral data, or at least some willingness to behave data, right? So are you willing to use this type of technology? Let's say this would be implemented in your organization. Would you be willing to engage with it? Would you be willing to trust or rely on this type of technology? So up to now, that's been the type of study that we've been doing. We would love to extend it at some point to the actual AI agent, so people actually engage with, I don't know, a robot, for instance, or an algorithm or chatbot. But we're not there yet, and that we are not there yet precisely because we want to identify the conditions under which ambivalence is high, and we want to be able to show that AI ambivalence is actually a thing, and we will be able to measure it correctly. So we're really sort of trying to isolate it in the lab, or in the last few years mostly online because the lab was closed due to Corona. But that's the type of studies we're doing right now.
Yeah, maybe one last question before we open up the floor to other questions from the audience. Sure. What I was interested in when you mentioned before the role of trust there, and how maybe trust with a technological agent and with a human could look quite different. So, I mean, one ingredient of trust, or one aspect that comes hand in hand, basically, is that trust can also be betrayed. And if I think now in a, let's say, human machine interaction with a technological agent, and people are ambivalent about this agent and have oscillations in their behavior, but also maybe in their opinion, to me, that sounds like they are in quite a vulnerable state, and they could easily be manipulated by the other side. In this case, the technological agent. So, what do you think about the vulnerability of people who are using these systems if this trust relationship becomes becomes stronger over time.
So your question is, if I understand it correctly, if there's a danger in building trust with technology, because you become too vulnerable, basically.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, in a way, you could say that if there wouldn't be no ambivalence, you wouldn't need trust, right? Because trust is a sort of a willingness to be vulnerable is typically the definition. Is or a positive attitude toward the future is another definition sometimes used, right? So if I wouldn't be ambivalent, if I would be made up my mind about that this technology is saying it's a good thing or a bad thing, I wouldn't be able to need to trust it. It's just trust is there because of the ambivalence situation. So I think, I mean, I do see your point. I think it's I mean, obviously trust can be betrayed and can be misused. That's also true in the interpersonal sphere, right? I can be misguided in my trust judgments. I think that what we just call uncritical use, but also uncritical rejection of technology, actually is can be more problematic than trust. Because trust implies at least sort of a recognition of the ambivalence that you feel towards your technology. On the other hand, I'm also sort of interested in trust as a phenomenon, as an interpersonal phenomenon. And in that literature, what we see is that people start talking about optimal trust, which is not uncritical, not blind trust, but sort of the correct combination of trust and distrust. And I think that's a very interesting sort of concept that also may be relevant for our relations with AI agents, right? And I think that being able sort of to live with ambivalence, right, might inform optimal trust in a way, right? So if you have both the thought, okay, this is a very promising, interesting new technology that can help me get so much more out of my work, right? If I'm sort of, for instance, a helicopter pilot, but it's also dangerous and it's also potentially problematic. I have both these thoughts, and one of the first thought might inspire and inform trust, but the other thought might inspire some level of distrust. So it might be more likely that when I sort of productively engage with that ambivalence, I get to sort of a level of optimal trust. I'm willing to be vulnerable to the technology, but not uncritically so.
Yeah, I like this this notion of optimal trust in political science. We also, when we talk with political or talk about political trust, it's the same issue, right? Often a decline in trust in Western democracies is often equated to problem for democracy, even though you could argue it is a good thing because people become more critical and don't blindly trust the government. At the same time, there is a minimum amount of trust needed in order to move forward. And I really like taking this notion and applying it also to the interaction between humans and machines. So maybe we open up the floor to other participants, and I already see Ljubisha raising his hand, so go ahead.
Yes, this was a very, very interesting talk. I was very fascinated by your work. And although these concepts that you brought up immediately connected to much of my own work when it comes to algorithmic regulation and legal regulation of AI. Because within the current regulatory framework, we see requirements of good human oversight, being able to critically assess the algorithms that you use. And explicitly, a large part of that within the current AI Act is that humans need to be aware of automation bias, so not trusting algorithms, AI too much. But what I'm hearing in your account is a more nuanced approach, both being over-trusting and being too critical at the same time. Do you think that within moving forward as academics, we should include a more nuanced approach, both including over trust and being also overly critical at the same time?
So you mean in our academic work, we should like look at both these phenomena?
Well, yes, because what I'm seeing currently in algorithmic governance studies is that most of the work is on being over trusting and not critical enough.
Right.
But what I'm hearing is a bit of a different, more nuanced paradigm that you're proposing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much, or not much. I know a little bit about AI governance, but that's not my field. So I'm not necessarily can speak to that literature. But what I do think is there is also a danger to be overly critical, right? And for instance, in for the realm of self-driving vehicles, let's take an example, right? Now we see there's some reporting on deaths caused by SDVs, and that causes widespread rejection of flashlights. Some people are getting very wary of these cars, but there might also be a big solution to many problems that we have in our society, right? So one problem of being sort of overly critical is that we set the bar way too high for types of technologies that may, in fact, be very beneficial to society, may generate lots of economic value, and so on, right? So I think that we have to basically, it's in a way, sort of back to the talk about optimal trust that we just had. And so we want to like strike that balance just right, and I think that it can be sort of an attractive thought to say let's err on the side of caution, basically. And I can see from sort of a governance perspective that's typically where you are when you're talking about governance, right? But on the other hand, right, everybody knows that there's a great potential in these technologies. We don't want to sort of stifle that. Yeah, so I think that trying to find sort of an optimal balance would be at least ideal, and it's probably going to be hard in practice, right? We'll sometimes be overly critical, but sometimes we'll be overly trusting. We'll have to overcorrect.
Yeah,
that's so on. But like if we, going back to the SDV example, if we like stop the development of technology that might save many lives in traffic, I think that would ultimately be a bad thing. Right.
It's a very good point, and I think that we're not enough aware of having also being overly critical. In my own research, I once researched a use of algorithmic content moderation and how that might cause discrimination. But at the same time, if you try to solve that through a human moderator checking everything, that person might also be even more discriminatory than the algorithm reviewing. And this is a very good point that you raise. I think this is something we need to focus on more looking forward.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, and maybe tying back to that what you just said, I think this is often the case. Like, do we have to hold AI to a higher standard than humans? And when do we say, okay, this is now a large enough improvement to the status quo that we are willing to give maybe authority to algorithmic agents? And on an individual level, this is quite, well, it is still very difficult, but it is difficult inside of your head because you're fighting your own ambivalence. But on a societal level, that is a lot more tricky, I would say. When do we say, and I think self-driving cars is a really good example. So how good do self-driving cars need to be in order for us as a society to introduce them on the streets at a large scale? And have you had insight in this as well, or is your research more focusing on the individual trying to find an answer to this question?
Yeah. So my research is only individual level, so I don't really look at the societal level. So one thought that popped into my mind while you were speaking is the following: is that I think that one of the reasons we hold AI to such a high standard may have to do with ambivalence as well, right? And so what we talked about is just that when I feel ambivalent, I basically take the next cue that I get to make a judgment and to go into one extreme or the other extreme. So I see an AI system making one mistake that makes me tend to like go to the negative direction and go and get very averse to using the technology. I think that, and again, I'm not a researcher that looks at societal level, but I think that maybe partly an answer to this is that we can educate people about the fact that AI systems are not always flawless, right? That there will be, even if we have like only SDVs, that there still will be accidents, but maybe just much less than we're used to right now. Or in the case under the example that Lubitsa just mentioned, that if we use AI systems for recruitment, for instance, that there might still be bias, but maybe less bias than if you just use human evaluators, human moderators. So I do think that maybe here literacy and education might be at least give part of the answer to this conundrum.
Yeah, and I see that resonating a lot within the AI research community, that more AI literacy is needed, definitely, because the systems actually by the day get more advanced and get implemented into society. Mm-hmm. I see one question in the chat. Irina, do you maybe want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my background is in media studies, and in media studies we studied at some point about surveillance capitalism and the way the current economical and technological system kind of drives people into a state of apathy at times because of the way companies act upon their algorithms and on their politics. And I was wondering, what do you think their role is in regards to training this apathy of the public when we deal with ambivalence of algorithms in human attitudes?
Your question is whether or not companies play a role in that, or
yes, and how do you think it is perceived by people at the end of the day, and why it is perceived like that, maybe?
Well, it's hard for me to speak to the intentions of companies. I mean, does Netflix or I don't know, YouTube or Google or whatever intentionally try to sort of critical use of the technology? I do think that they profit, right? I mean, ultimately, it's part of the business model of Netflix in a way that we just don't think about the way the algorithm functions anymore. So I don't know whether they intentionally go for that. It's just, I mean, it is a result of the way that the system is set up in a way. To the extent that sort of that what you call apathy or what I call uncritical use is an essential part of the business model. I don't think we should expect such companies to step in and make people at least more aware of that they're actually ambivalent rather than apathic, or that they say, well, maybe you should think about like the information that you're feeding towards. So I think this is sort of a cop out that we typically get to in these types of discussions, but ultimately that is something that I would guess is more up to regulation and governance to at least like get people to be more aware of what is happening. It's in a way it's sort of similar to the privacy discussion, right? I mean, it's super annoying that I constantly have to agree to whether or not I want to have cookies on my computer. But at least makes me a little bit more aware of what's going on, right? And maybe that's is to some extent that's what something that to some extent to happen also in this sense.
Thank you so much for your answer.
Sure.
Thank you. Are there other questions in the chat? Or no, in the chat not, but in the audience? Just unmute yourself if you... No. No other questions. Yeah, maybe because when you just talked about it, I had the one thought that I wanted to share as well here.
Mm-hmm.
And this is that when these you said you investigate different types of AI technologies, from chatbots and also maybe these social media algorithms or something like this. And I thought, like, okay, these algorithms, the more we use them, the better they get to know us as well, right? Because of our behavior. And once we resolved our ambivalence, we always have to make, or not always, but often have to make a binary decision. Either we do that or we do that. So it is, and the more we do this, the more the algorithm knows what was actually responsible for making this decision. So could this be, in a way, like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because the algorithms constantly improves and knows my ambivalence better and can actually then, maybe we go back to this manipulation question a bit, but
yeah,
is this a way that I actually lose some sovereignty because the algorithm, if it's let's say a social media algorithm or any other type of advice giving algorithm or agent, as you call them, so is this like a self-fulfilling prophecy that we lose sovereignty because the algorithm can better trick our own ambivalence?
Yeah, I mean that's a fascinating question. I think that's quite plausible. That there's some level of truth to that. But I still think that the things we've been talking about, like optimal trust, or something like paradox mindset, are helpful here in the following way: is that, like, yes, in a way, like, use or not use is a binary decision, and if I constantly I'm in that state of doubt, I'm in that state of ambivalence, and I make a binary decision, and the algorithm might learn what causes me to go one way or the other, right? And may then, it may, I don't know, give me a silly example, maybe like the color orange will lead to higher, we will learn likely to use, where the color brown does not. It will constantly show me like a brown web page, or an orange one in this example. I'm much more susceptible to that type of manipulation when I'm constantly motivated to resolve my ambivalence as quickly as possible, right? If I'm in a state of doubt, I'm in a state of ambivalence, and there is something that comes up that makes me jump to one way or the other. But if I'm more willing to say, okay, this state of ambivalence is sort of the natural way of interacting with this technology. This is the way I'm supposed to be in response to technology. I can trust the technology to do X, but I always also have to have some level of distrust, right? The optimal trust idea. So I stay vigilant for maybe some types of these manipulations that you mentioned. I think that at the very least, I can make more informed decisions myself whether or not to use, and not like be manipulated into use just because something is shown in orange rather than brown, right? So I feel like it's still important to try and train ourselves for as far as possible to be able to live and face ambivalence specifically in these contexts.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was really interesting. So maybe asking the audience one last time, if you have one more question you want to ask. And if not, it is my honor to close the session. Gijs, it was really interesting to get an insight into your research. Looking forward to reading more when it comes out. Is there any, don't want to pressure you here, but do you know that, do you have any papers already ready that we can read up on? Or
we do have some papers ready, but they're not like submitted yet. So once we submit, we'll let you know, and then we'll also like post them.
Yeah, that would be great. All right. Thank you so much for coming on the Humane AI Conversations, and looking forward to seeing what's coming out here.
Okay, great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.